John Ronald Reuel Tolkien was born on January 3, 1892, in Bloemfontein, South Africa. Tolkien's father was Arthur Reuel Tolkien, born on February 18, 1857. The unusual family name is somewhat derived from being descended from immigrants from the Prussian region in East Germany who migrated to Britain by the mid-18th century. Arthur was the manager of the Bank of Africa in the Orange Free State when his young bride, Mabel Suffield from Birmingham, traveled to Cape Town so they could marry. South Africa, a colony at the time, presented opportunities for young Europeans seeking their fortunes, aided by the expansion of gold and diamond mining that created employment opportunities in the banking institutions. Therefore, the young Arthur traveled there, his father being a piano maker in Birmingham before his bankruptcy, striving to amass wealth in the 1880s. When they married in 1891 in Cape Town, Arthur was in his mid-30s, while Mabel was in her early 20s. Although Arthur and Mabel's marriage seemed to be the ideal middle-class lifestyle that many Britons aspired to during this period, it was somewhat distant, as Arthur spent long hours in the office or traveling for work. During this time, J.R.R. Tolkien was born in January 1892. Mabel gave birth to another son, Hilary Arthur Reuel, on February 17, 1894, but it was not destined for the children to spend the rest of their childhood in South Africa. The young family, excluding Arthur, decided to return to England, a decision based on the prevailing belief that the hot climates were not conducive to the English constitution. Mabel and Arthur used this reasoning to explain John Ronald's health issues at school, along with the onset of drought in South Africa. Mabel embarked on a journey aboard the SS Guelph, returning to Birmingham in April 1895, where the young family awaited Arthur's arrival. However, Arthur never made it, as he succumbed to acute rheumatic fever and bleeding to death by February 15, 1896. Mabel Tolkien proved to be a strong and independent woman, dedicated to seeking the best for her children and attempting to provide them with the best upbringing possible under challenging circumstances after Arthur's death. Mabel, an educated woman, initially taught her sons Latin, French, and German, in addition to supplying them with all the storybooks they could read under Mabel's excellent guidance. Tolkien learned to read and write at the age of 4 and soon began studying various languages. Mabel relocated her sons throughout England, searching for the ideal school for them, but also to remove the family from under the excessive scrutiny of Mabel's parents and their oppressive influence. In 1896, the three moved to Shire, a small village outside Birmingham. The time Tolkien spent in Shire particularly influenced his growing interest in the environment and his deep love for trees and nature. This pastoral love can be clearly seen in his later works, such as The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. Shire Mill and its surrounding area became a source of inspiration for Tolkien in creating the Shire, even mentioned in the introduction to The Lord of the Rings. He recalls playing in the mill's courtyard, being chased by the angry miller, imagining hunters and immersing himself in nature. Although it is now a suburb of Birmingham, at that time it was a genuinely picturesque rural area, fertile and peaceful, sharply contrasting with the industrial modernity of nearby Birmingham. Tolkien mentioned that he had never seen a car until his family left the area, when he discovered, years later, that the mill had fallen into disrepair and the idyllic nature of his childhood had been demolished due to urban expansion. His sorrow was evident. Another significant aspect of J.R.R. Tolkien's upbringing that greatly influenced his life and writing was his mother's conversion to Roman Catholicism. Her conversion and subsequent estrangement from her family led Mabel to another move, this time to a Birmingham suburb called Moseley. Here, Tolkien encountered Father Francis Xavier Morgan, named after the founder of the famous Jesuit society from the 16th century, who would become an important figure in young Tolkien's life. In 1904, Mabel moved the family once again. Similar to their move from Bloemfontein, this transition from city to countryside hastened illness once more. Young John Ronald and his brother Hilary contracted measles and whooping cough, while Mabel herself was diagnosed with diabetes. Unfortunately, at that time, there wasn't much that could be done for diabetes. The family moved closer to Father Morgan so he could assist in caring for them all. Tragically, due to complications from diabetes, Mabel fell ill and passed away on November 14, 1904, leaving John Tolkien and his younger brother as orphans. Father Morgan became the guardian of the boys after Mabel's death, and the two orphans moved to their Aunt Beatrice's apartment in Birmingham to be closer to their school, King Edward School. During the reign of King Edward, Tolkien first laid eyes on Old English, the spoken and written language used in most of Britain during the early Middle Ages. Tolkien's dedication to languages became a lifelong passion, both as a scholar and as a creator of his own languages. Additionally, during these formative teenage years, Tolkien met his future wife, Edith Bratt. Born on January 21, 1889, Edith was 3 years older than Tolkien. She was a skilled pianist, and like Tolkien, she was an orphan living in an inner-city home in Birmingham. The two developed a friendship that blossomed into a love story. However, the romantic phase of their relationship didn't last long. Father Morgan grew frustrated that Tolkien was dedicating time to childhood romance instead of his studies, and he forbade the couple from meeting again or even corresponding until Tolkien came of age. Edith turned 21. Morgan was particularly bothered by the fact that Edith was a Protestant. The separation from Edith, despite its difficulty, was not insurmountable, facilitated by Tolkien's close-knit group of male friendships within literary circles. While Tolkien later had female students and academic colleagues, his early environment, dominated by male camaraderie, became an integral part of his life and also influenced his work. His friendship groups spent their time smoking pipes, crafting original materials, or reading works in their original Greek, Latin, or Old English. One of Tolkien's earliest social groups was the Tea Club, formed in 1911 at King Edward's house when Tolkien was 19 years old. This club was founded by Tolkien and fellow students such as Christopher Wiseman, R.Q. Gilson. Many members of the Tea Club would face their destinies on the battlefields in France by the end of the decade, leaving a lasting impression on Tolkien and his work. Although Tolkien himself denied its influence in personal letters to friends, many scholars consider it a lasting impact. This period spanned the 40s and 50s. Tolkien was accepted into the University of Oxford as an undergraduate student in 1911, a feat made possible through a scholarship from the university, the exhibition to Exeter College. He won this award after a notable performance at King Edward's School, where he was a member of the debating society. Through this, he showcased his linguistic abilities in Old English, Greek, and Gothic, while also referring to ancient Germanic languages, both in speech and writing. Tolkien's acceptance into Oxford was just a humble beginning to a long relationship with the university. He eventually became a respected professor of English language, teaching philology, Old English, and related subjects. Tolkien was always fascinated by languages, whether in learning them or creating them. This fascination profoundly influenced his works, including The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, where he invented entire languages. Similarly, Tolkien became a renowned philologist. Philology is the study of languages and linguistics, often focusing on ancient languages. Academically, while writing The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien published translations of stories and poetry, such as Middle English poetry from the 14th century. Oxford was also formative for Tolkien in other ways. However, Tolkien's early years at Oxford were interrupted due to the outbreak of war across Europe. World War I began on July 28, 1914. After the outbreak of World War I, Tolkien was determined to complete his studies at Oxford before enlisting to be with his fellow countrymen. Tolkien spent his time in training to become an officer and wrote a significant amount of poetry during this period, some of which contained surreal and plant-themed influences. For instance, in 1914, Tolkien wrote the poem Goblin Feet for Edith, a poetic celebration of her love for spring. The following year, this became his first published written piece, appearing in Oxford Poetry. This was a significant moment, even though Tolkien later developed a dislike for the poem, referring to it as the wretched thing that represents all that I came shortly after. Very much to dislike, considering it somewhat childishly imitative of fairies and Despite this retrospective dislike for some of his early works, poetry remained a crucial aspect of Tolkien's later writings, with over 60 poems included in The Lord of the Rings. It is likely that Tolkien's most significant literary work during this time is his writing of The Voyage of Eärendil the Evening Star, another poem, but the first one that can be recognized from Middle-earth, the world in which the events of The Lord of the Rings and any of Tolkien's other works take place. He also wrote 3 other poems about Eärendil around this time, burning them into his imagination to such an extent that the character of Eärendil remained largely unchanged since then, to the point that he received some references in The Lord of the Rings. You might recall Frodo and Sam's use of the Field of Galadriel, a pure and bright light, to defeat Shelob. This light was captured from the star Eärendil. The broader myth that emerged over the years and subsequent decades initially came from him trying to discover the story of Eärendil and his world, although that had to wait a few years until the harsh realities of the real world hit home. After graduating from Oxford in 1915, Tolkien was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Lancashire Fusiliers. As in his youth, Tolkien travelled all over England, from Bedford to Staffordshire and other places. He continued his military training as a British officer, specialising in signals, which included learning Morse code and how to send messages, a fitting pursuit for a man who was so deeply fascinated with languages. At the same time, on March 22, 1916, Tolkien and Edith Bratt got married after knowing each other for several years, finally tying the knot in a mourning ceremony at the Church of St. Mary Immaculate in Warwick. Edith agreed to convert to Roman Catholicism for the success of their marriage, a decision that led to a rift with her adoptive guardian. Tolkien and Edith didn't have much time to celebrate their final union, as Tolkien would soon be shipped to the Western Front in France. Tolkien landed in Calais on June 6, 1916. There, he was one of many newly arrived troops in France, following the devastating losses at the Battle of Verdun in the previous February. Tolkien's battalion participated in the First Battle of the Somme, a massive offensive that took place between the French and British forces on one side and the Germans on the other. The battle began on July 1, 1916, and lasted for a total of 141 days, resulting in around 1 million casualties on both sides. The British suffered approximately 20,000 casualties on the first day of the infantry attack, making it one of the bloodiest days in British military history. The war had profound consequences for Tolkien's fellowship, particularly as members of his old social club, including Rob Gilson and G.B. Smith, were lost. Consequently, only Tolkien and Christopher Wiseman remained from their original group. Tolkien contracted what was known as trench fever during the conflict. Trench fever was a disease transmitted by lice in the trenches, affecting over a third of British soldiers on the Western Front during World War I. It was characterized by severe headaches, fever, and muscle pain lasting for several days after the incubation period. After being evacuated to the rear lines and receiving care in a French hospital in Le Touquet, Tolkien was transported back to England for recovery, where he was reunited with Edith, influenced by his experiences in the trenches and his love for epics like the Finnish Kalevala. Tolkien began working on what he called the Book of Lost Tales. Over the next few years, he wrote several stories that would form the foundation for the Silmarillion. The first of these was the story of the fall of Gondolin, followed by other grand tales of Beren and Luthien and the children of Furin. Additionally, he started to organize his efforts in creating languages for his invented world. In fact, he had been inventing languages since his childhood, but now he directly connected his linguistic creativity to building his world. He continued working on all these works throughout his life, and while he did publish some completed works such as The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, much of his remaining work remained under continuous revision until his final days. The extent of Tolkien's ambition was evident as he not only created backgrounds for some stories, but constructed a broad mythic framework from which stories could emerge. Meanwhile, Tolkien left the hospital in October 1916 after 2 years of convalescence, interspersed with military postings across England. He suffered recurrent illnesses upon resettlement and frequently returned to the hospital for recovery. During this time, Edith and Tolkien started building their family. Their first son, John Francis Reuel, was born on November 16, 1917. Shortly after, the young family returned to Oxford, where Tolkien took a position as an assistant lexicographer. In the summer of 1920, Tolkien applied for and was appointed as a reader in English language at the University of Leeds. There Tolkien connected with another young scholar, Eric Valentine Gordon. Gordon, a skilled linguist and researcher, matched Tolkien's proficiency and intelligence in Old Norse and Anglo-Saxon languages. They became close friends, eventually forming the Viking Club, where they invented Anglo-Saxon songs and poems, among other scholarly entertainments. At the same time, Tolkien's family continued to grow. He and Edith welcomed another son, Michael Hilary Reuel, born on October 22, 1920, and a third boy, Christopher Reuel, born on November 21, 1924. Christopher would later become a scholar in his own right, playing a significant role in editing and publishing his father's works after many years. In close proximity to Christopher's birth, Tolkien applied for the position of the Anglo-Saxon professorship at his alma mater, the University of Oxford. The application was successful, and Tolkien returned to Oxford, where he would continue to deliver lectures for most of the remainder of his life. In 1926, the Tolkien family moved to Northmoor Road. It was during this time that much of the work on The Hobbit took place. The family stayed in this residence for 21 years, marking one of the longest sustainable periods Tolkien lived in any one place. In this period, The Tolkien family was completed with the birth of Priscilla on June 18, 1929. It's challenging to understate the importance of Tolkien's children in his life. He was a devoted father, often sending them illustrated letters and reading them stories from his invented worlds. It might be an exaggeration to suggest, as some have, that Tolkien wrote The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings specifically for John, Michael, Christopher, and Priscilla. However, there is no doubt that they would play a role in shaping his world, Middle-earth, and the characters inhabiting it. There is an element of childhood fantasy throughout the narrative, while the novels also address adult themes and provide moral lessons. Returning to Oxford, Tolkien's social and literary circles also expanded. In 1926, one of Tolkien's most famous groups and clubs was formed. It was in this year that Tolkien met Clive Staples Lewis, known as C.S. Lewis, the renowned author of the Chronicles of Narnia. The interactions and relationships within these circles, along with the influence of his own children, contributed to the richness and depth of Tolkien's literary works. Tolkien and Lewis enjoyed a long-lasting friendship marked by mutual respect and admiration, despite periods of physical distance between them. The growing Anglicanism of Lewis was one reason for this distance, as Tolkien's Catholicism influenced his world. While some claim that religion and literature do not go hand in hand, this was not the case for Tolkien. Some biographers mention that the Silmarillion was profoundly religious, and Tolkien considered writing The Lord of the Rings a Christian duty and endeavor. Much of Tolkien's sense of the religious importance of his work stemmed from his belief that he wasn't merely creating myths. Rather, he was revealing truths akin to what a historian might do. He crafted for himself a persona in the world as an academic unraveling the stories of Middle-earth, to the extent that he would sometimes adopt this persona in responding to fan letters. He engaged with their questions and theories by suggesting alternative interpretations of his work and different ways to translate the languages he had created. For Tolkien, his creation was not an entirely separate world, but rather a realm in a different state. In this way, Tolkien saw it as his duty to unveil the truth within the myth and to comprehend human patterns throughout history. The biographer Humphrey Carpenter captured this sentiment about Tolkien's work, stating, "Just as speech is an invention about things and ideas, myth is an invention about truth." Understanding the fantastical world Tolkien was constructing since the 1920s, culminating in the creation of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, requires delving into the academic journey of Tolkien. Tolkien's work spans several decades, whether during a brief period at Leeds or primarily at Oxford, focusing on elements of Anglo-Saxon poetry and prose, as well as the epic elements of English and Norse mythology. These influences profoundly shaped the way in which he develops the world of Middle-earth. For instance, during his time at Leeds in the early to mid-1920s, Tolkien worked on Middle English vocabulary. This involved creating a glossary for the varieties of English spoken and written between approximately 1100 and 1400, a period spanning from the Norman conquest to the early movements of the Renaissance in England. His work in Middle English, alongside his exploration of Old English in the early medieval period, played a significant role in shaping the language used in The Lord of the Rings and other works. One notable aspect in this regard is the intertwining of Tolkien's portrayal of elves in Middle-earth and some Anglo-Saxon writings. Tolkien not only studied, but also taught and edited certain Anglo-Saxon texts. During his time at Leeds and Oxford, he contributed to the study and publication of some of the most important works of English epic poetry and prose. While at Leeds, he collaborated with E.V. Gordon, in editing an edition of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, a 14th century romantic Arthurian story involving Sir Gawain, one of the Knights of the Round Table. Elements from the Arthurian cycle can be seen entering Tolkien's fantasy world in the form of Rohirrim, or, in reality, Aragorn, as a kind of pseudo-Arthurian king. When Tolkien returned to Oxford in the mid-1920s, he was working on an edition of one of the most important Anglo-Saxon epic poems ever, Beowulf, although the edition was never published. As he completed it in 1926, he delivered a number of famous lectures at the time that solidified his reputation as one of the foremost scholars of Beowulf in the world. Studies of Tolkien's works tend to argue for the defense of the Dark Lord, Sauron, whom Tolkien positioned as the primary antagonist in The Lord of the Rings, drawing parallels with the great Anglo-Saxon adversary Grendel in the epic poem. It is crucial to understand Tolkien's literary output in constructing the world of Middle-earth as an extension of the Anglo-Saxon and English mythology that captivated his academic pursuits in Leeds and Oxford. Perhaps it was in the summer of 1930 when this grand vision began to crystallize around a very simple story. In one of the most famous moments of inspiration in history, Tolkien was grading exam papers when a sentence came to him that would shape the entire narrative. In a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit, and he quickly scribbled it on the back of an exam paper he was grading. It became the foundation for a longer story centered around the character Bilbo Baggins and the emergence of the Hobbit. In the following years, it evolved into a much larger narrative. Despite this crucial start, Tolkien, like any writer, needed a circle of critique and support. This support network materialized fully in the form of the Inklings in the early 30s. Membership was irregular, especially during the outbreak of World War II and the subsequent dispersal of members or the inability to gather at the pub due to wartime constraints. When the group was first formed, its members included Tolkien, Lewis, Oxford physician R.A., Harvard Lewis's elder brother Warren Lewis, barrister Owen Barfield, and English literature lecturer at the University of Reading, Hugo Dyson. While they held a variety of professions, the Inklings were bound together by their shared interest in literature and their Christianity. Due to these connections, Tolkien often presented early drafts of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings to the other Inklings. The Hobbit began as stories Tolkien told to his children. Some of these stories and poems were never written down, while others were never published. Nevertheless, Tolkien suggested many of these tales to his publishers at various times as possible appendices to The Hobbit. For instance, Tolkien once wrote a whimsical poem titled The Adventures of Tom Bombadil, named after one of Michael Tolkien's dolls. In 1934, this poem was published in an Oxford magazine. Tolkien enjoyed tactile mediums such as watercolors, which he used to create illustrations for the Silmarillion in the 1920s. In addition to the maps and illustrations of Middle-earth that eventually found their way into The Hobbit, the children's stories written by other authors from his childhood also influenced Tolkien when writing The Hobbit. The film The Hobbit tells the story of Bilbo Baggins, a hobbit living in a cozy home in Bag End, in the quaint town of Hobbiton in the Shire, a region in Middle-earth where people lead primarily idyllic lives, until Bilbo, encouraged by the wizard Gandalf, becomes entangled with a group of dwarves trying to reclaim their homeland. There are already quite a few similarities between Tolkien and the novel's protagonist, Bilbo. Both Bilbo and Tolkien belong to the comfortable middle class and embody characteristics and habits of a respectable lifestyle. They are sensible people of average age who don't travel much. In fact, Tolkien himself, despite his love for learning countless languages and various cultures, did not travel extensively to these places. In his old age, the only place he spent his vacations was the English seaside, and even that he did not enjoy much. He confessed, saying, "I am in fact a hobbit in all but size." He loved gardens, trees, and non-mechanized farmlands. He smoked a pipe and enjoyed good ordinary food, non-refrigerated. During the process of crafting The Hobbit, many character names underwent changes. The dwarf who originally carried the name Gandalf was later changed to Thorin, and the dragon, originally named Prifton, became Smaug. Tolkien chose several names from the Old Norse poetic and prose collection known as the Edda, a compilation of Old Norse mythology and Icelandic legends. Inspired by elements of Norse and Icelandic myth, Tolkien drew from his personal life to show. For instance, Baggins was inspired by his Aunt Jane's farm in Worcestershire, England. The character Gandalf drew inspiration from a postcard of J. Madlener's artwork titled Der Burgist, or the Mountain Spirit. The artwork depicted an old man sitting in the forest, patiently harmonizing with the surrounding wildlife. The Shire, fundamentally, represents a romanticized version of England, as Tolkien and many others in his time wished it to be. The Hobbit was far from complete, let alone published. As it was written for Tolkien's children and evolved with their growth, Tolkien saw no reason to conclude the story. However, a former student of Tolkien named Elaine Griffiths read the story and thought it was marvelous. In 1936, she gave the incomplete manuscript to an employee at Allen for him to read. This employee was Susan Dagnall. After a somewhat challenging revision process by Tolkien, The Perfectionist was published on September 21, 1937, and copies were sold by December. Following the success of The Hobbit, Tolkien hoped to publish the Silmarillion. However, due to its initial confusing mix of poetry and prose, along with its considerable length, Alan Unwin chose not to publish it. One of the most challenging aspects of the work for the publisher to market was its lack of a traditional narrative framework within the Silmarillion. Simultaneously, fans practically clamored for more stories centered around hobbits. Meeting the desires of both fans and the publisher for more Hobbit stories, combined with Tolkien's desire to incorporate elements from the mythologies mentioned in the Silmarillion, motivated Tolkien to begin what became known as The Lord of the Rings. As with The Hobbit, many character names in The Lord of the Rings changed over time. Originally, Frodo Baggins' name was Bingo Baggins, and he was Bilbo's nephew. Other characters, perhaps most notably those who became the Hobbits Merry and Pippin, were originally Bingo's cousins, Odo and Frodo. Just like with Hobbit character names, Tolkien drew inspiration from his life. For example, the name Gamgee came from the colloquial term for cotton wool when he was growing up in Birmingham. However, more importantly, The Lord of the Rings is inspired by Tolkien's love for the natural landscapes of England and the people who inhabited the land. His affection and nostalgia for the trees, forests, and water features from his childhood played a significant role. As Tolkien smoothly wrote the first chapter about Bilbo Baggins' birthday party, he found himself uncertain about where the plot of the new story would go next. Given this limited planning, the story naturally evolved, with Tolkien introducing a menacing Black Rider into the early chapters. This character would later become the Ringwraiths. Interestingly, it wasn't until the writing of The Lord of the Rings that the ring Bilbo stole from Gollum in The Hobbit became the One Ring. Previously, there was no concept of the One Ring to rule them all. Tolkien added any foreshadowing on this matter during one of his numerous revisions of The Hobbit. When Tolkien began writing the book that would eventually be published, as the concluding part of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. The world he inhabited had once again been marred by war, the aftermath of World War I, in which Tolkien himself had fought years earlier, had created a myriad of new challenges. World War II, more than any other major European war, was perceived as a conflict between good and evil, given the nature of the war raging across Europe when Tolkien was writing a significant portion of The Lord of the Rings. Many commentators tended to view the epic as an allegory for World War II. For example, Sauron's character could be seen as representing Adolf Hitler, an embodiment of absolute evil, while the orcs in the novels could be actual symbols of the German Wehrmacht. The two towers in the second book of the trilogy might be considered as Nazi Germany and one of its allies, either Benito Mussolini's Italy or the Empire of Japan. In a similar vein, the tense relationships between the powers of Rohan, Gondor, the elves, and the dwarves in The Lord of the Rings can be seen as allegorical to the divisions among the different allied powers of Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union. Despite being highly divided, they found a common cause in facing the greatest evil represented by Nazi Germany since 1941 onwards. Many have suggested that the dark turn in Tolkien's story, involving the Ringwraiths and the fiery Mount Doom, might have been influenced by this global context. However, Tolkien himself emphatically stated in the introduction to The Lord of the Rings that he cordially despises allegory in all its manifestations. Despite being aware that authors' experiences might influence their works, his intention was that his story reflected that without having any allegorical reference whatsoever. There is another way to completely view The Lord of the Rings. This includes the idea that the epic is actually an example of the processes of modernity and how it corrupted the world. Tolkien was heavily influenced by the writings of William Morris, a British poet, artist, novelist, architect, and environmental activist from the 19th century, who rejected the forces of modernity and industrialization in Britain. Instead, he advocated for British arts and crafts as practiced before the war. The Industrial Revolution that began in the mid-19th century, many elements of The Lord of the Rings strongly criticize industrialization, especially the sections in what would eventually become the Two Towers, where Isengard rises to become an ally of Sauron and begins building an industrial army relying on the destruction of the great forests in the Middle East. In this sense, Tolkien portrays the Shire as the ideal representation of what England was before the Industrial Revolution, while Sauron and Isengard represent the opposite. The ultimate product of these malignant effects is Gollum himself, a character destroyed by greed and materialism created by industrialization and the emergence of the consumer society. However, the truth is that the world of Middle-earth, with elements of Anglo-Saxon mythology, narrative storytelling, and contemporary parallels to both World War and i.e. industrialization, nationalism, and modernity, was incredibly vast and intertwined in Tolkien's created world. It's not possible to pinpoint a single influence on his ideas. In fact, Tolkien originally conceived Middle-earth and began writing about it in the 1920s as a form of personal mythology that he used to explore various ideas about philology, ontology, mythology, and other aspects of his professional and personal life. It would be an oversimplification to assert that The Lord of the Rings is a direct allegorical statement about World War II. Its layers are highly complex, and such a reading does not do justice to it. Writing The Lord of the Rings was a long and arduous process. In fact, it took Tolkien 12 years to write the story, along with another 4 years to revise and make it publishable. The lengthy manuscript was divided into 3 volumes upon completion. The Fellowship of the Ring, The Two Towers, and The Return of the King. However, this decision was made due to the paper shortages of that time. Originally, Tolkien composed the story as a single narrative in 6 parts, but post-war paper shortages in Britain led publishers to convince Tolkien to publish it in 3 books. Consequently, the names of these 3 volumes were artificial constructs, and Tolkien himself was not pleased with the title of the last book because he believed it revealed too much about the ending. Therefore, he wanted the title to be The War of the Ring instead. He also disliked The Two Towers and complained to his publisher that he wasn't entirely sure which towers the title referred to. The material that originally composed it was 2 or 3 books titled The Treason of Isengard and The Ring Goes East, when Tolkien initially wrote those volumes. Part of the delay in publishing The Lord of the Rings can be attributed to Tolkien deciding that it was, in fact, just a sequel to his unpublished work The Silmarillion, a history and mythology of Middle-earth. Tolkien spent a significant amount of time trying to persuade the publisher to release The Silmarillion alongside The Lord of the Rings. Tolkien had been trying to convince them to publish The Silmarillion since 1937, but as mentioned earlier, they consistently resisted. A compromise was finally reached. Tolkien expanded much of the content in extensive appendices for The Return of the King. The Silmarillion in its larger form was never published during his lifetime. However, a few years after his death, his son Christopher edited his drafts, notes, and revisions into a final version and published it. The Fellowship of the Ring was published in August 1954, followed by 2 consecutive volumes in November 1954 and October 1955. Tolkien's stories quickly became beloved classics, establishing a broad global fan base in the early 60s. Indeed, early in 1955, the BBC broadcast a radio adaptation of The Fellowship of the Ring. Since then, fans expanded into the source material itself. In the 60s, a Tolkien Society was formed in London. People gathered at Hobbit walks, donning Hobbit attire and other Middle-earth outfits. Fame spread globally, leading to the formation of the Frodo Society in North Borneo, the mysterious island in the East Indian archipelago miles away from the world Tolkien lived and worked in throughout his life. All of this occurred during Tolkien's lifetime, not to mention the broad fan base that exists today. Tolkien spent much of the mid to late 50s expanding the scope of The Lord of the Rings, working on translating the text for publication in non-English speaking countries. Tolkien's house would receive phone calls from fans at all hours, with some even showing up at their doorstep, hoping to meet the renowned author in person. Despite this aversion to the public attention he attracted, Tolkien enjoyed responding to fan mail with long and detailed replies, although as he aged, he would misplace many of his responses somewhere in the house, only to rediscover them later and send them on their way. Tolkien continued writing until his final days, whether it was revising the Silmarillion or creating new works. For instance, in the mid-60s, he wrote Smith of Wootton Major, a short fantasy story about a man who swallowed a star and was transported to the land of Faerie. Tolkien considered it a meditation on aging and growing old. It was published by Allen N. Unwin in 1967. Edith and Tolkien moved to the coastal resort of Bournemouth in 1968, when the couple was in their 70s. By that time, Edith, who was 3 years older than Tolkien, was experiencing health issues that made managing their household and caring for him extremely challenging. They also wanted to escape the attention generated by Tolkien's former residence in Oxford, despite their retirement from teaching several years earlier. The couple lived in southern England for 3 years, during which Tolkien continued the task of reviewing and reorganizing the Silmarillion, hoping to finally find a publisher willing to publish the text he had been working on for over 30 years. However, while Edith's health briefly improved due to the seaside air, it eventually deteriorated further. In the fall of 1971, she was admitted to the hospital, where she suffered from gallbladder inflammation, and she passed away on November 29, 1971, at the age of 82. After Edith's death, Tolkien returned to Oxford, when he was invited by his former employer, Merton College, to live in a special set of rooms, and was given the title of Honorary Fellow Resident at the college. The Carr family, responsible for caring for the couple living below Tolkien's rooms, were available to take care of him, and they often shared meals together. Throughout the early 1970s, Tolkien received several honorary degrees, including an honorary Doctor of Letters from the University of Oxford. These honors were not for his novels but for his academic contributions to linguistics, significantly influencing his works. Tolkien spent his final years in this manner, suffering from a bleeding gastric ulcer and chest inflammation. After a short hospital stay, he passed away on September 2, 1973, at the age of 81. Tolkien's passing in 1973 did not mark the end of his works in the publishing world. Most of what he wrote about Middle-earth, and indeed the majority of it, remained unpublished until his death. It is easy to forget that The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings were the only complete stories from Middle-earth published during his lifetime. Both achieved tremendous success, but the other work he wrote about this world remained unpublished. In the years following his death, his son Christopher Tolkien took on the role of his father's literary executive. Finally, in 1977, after more than half a century since Tolkien began contemplating its publication, the Silmarillion, the mythology Tolkien had long desired to publish, was printed. Now one of the best-selling books in its own right, the Silmarillion has sold millions of copies. In the years following the release of an additional 12 volumes of the history of Middle-earth, reconstructed from various notes left by Tolkien, essays and random scribblings were edited and published. The three great tales from the First Age envisioned by Tolkien, Beren and Luthien, The Children of Húrin, and The Fall of Gondolin, were also published posthumously. This was followed by films, radio adaptations, and plays based on Tolkien's extensive writings about Middle-earth. Interest in the life and works of this great man continued to grow, although it is always challenging to verify total sales figures, especially since they do not account for used and third-party book sales. Industry experts often estimate that The Lord of the Rings is the best-selling novel of all time. It is surpassed only by religious texts such as the Bible and the Quran, along with Mao Zedong's Little Red Book, in overall book sales. However, it's worth noting that the Bible and the Quran have been in existence for thousands of years and are the foundational texts for the world's two largest religions. The Little Red Book was associated with a totalitarian state that compelled people to read it. In this context, The Lord of the Rings stands alone in book sales based on people's genuine appreciation for the text and their interest in it. The Hobbit is not far behind. The cultural impact of The Lord of the Rings and Middle-earth is truly epic. The cultural extension of Middle-earth stories has had a massive cultural impact in recent decades. Peter Jackson's film adaptation of The Lord of the Rings, in particular, garnered the most Oscars in any film series, with the final film in the trilogy, The Return of the King, winning 11 Academy Awards, the most ever for a single film, tying with Ben-Hur and Titanic. Indeed, the Rings of Power series is now streaming on Amazon Prime. touted as the most expensive television series ever made. However, perhaps the most significant indication is that The Lord of the Rings effectively spawned an entire genre of fantasy on its George.R.R. Martin, the author of Game of Thrones, openly acknowledges his debt to Tolkien, as do many others like Robert Jordan, the creator of the Wheel of Time series, a fantasy story that aspired to match Tolkien in its epic scope and mythical world-building. Hobbits, elves, dwarves, and orcs have now become prevalent and recognized worldwide. Perhaps despite his conflicting feelings, Tolkien did succeed in creating a mythos that resonates across cultures. Tolkien was indeed one of the greatest authors of the 20th century. Between the 1920s and 1950s, he crafted an entire world from which emerged The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, The Silmarillion, and numerous other works. These works effectively laid the foundations for an entire genre of literature, fantasy novels. Many giants in this field have acknowledged Tolkien's fundamental role in creating and popularizing this literary genre. While others may have imitated his work, none have surpassed Tolkien himself. As a professor adept at integrating elements from previous epics and traditions into his writings, and as a builder of vast and expansive worlds, it is doubtful that anyone else could write them because they reflect Tolkien's personal life, experiences, academic work, and his stances on family, friendship, and the society in which he lived in 1961. Tolkien was nominated for the Nobel Prize in Literature by his lifelong friend, C.S. Lewis. This nomination was perhaps premature, not because The Lord of the Rings did not deserve such recognition, but because the literary landscape of the 1960s did not readily accept works involving elves, dwarves, and hobbits wandering through a fantastical world called Middle-earth as fitting the criteria for the Nobel Prize. Two of the laureates in the early 1960s were John Steinbeck and Jean-Paul Sartre, whose works were more aligned with the existentialist philosophy when compared to works like those of Steinbeck and Sartre. Tolkien's creations might have been dismissed as mere fantasy or as a fantastical work that did not reflect the world and interests of the 20th century. However, this perspective fails to fully appreciate the historical depth embedded in Tolkien's works and the profound insights he offered into the consequences of creation and renewal. All those who engaged with Tolkien's publications, including The Lord of the Rings, were part of a cultural conversation that shaped and challenged societal norms. In this light, had Tolkien been alive and writing today, it is likely that he would have been considered for, and perhaps awarded the esteemed Nobel Prize in Literature during his lifetime. Tolkien's stories remind us of the importance of folklore and fantasy tales, emphasizing our connection with nature. His narratives evoke a sense of romance, a yearning for a simpler and more serene life, and tap into our childhood aspirations for fantastical stories about dragons, elves, and both large and small monsters. In works such as The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, The Silmarillion, and his other stories, Tolkien gifted the world with a new folklore of mythical tales that will undoubtedly continue to enchant and captivate countless generations in the future, turning Tolkien's own stories into legends and ensuring that his name remains a timeless one. If you liked the video, support us by subscribing to the channel and sharing it. Thanks for watching.